Our discussion of intervals. We've been talking about the intervals of the major scale, which are what qualities? Major and perfect. So we've been working with those qualities. We know major intervals we find where in the major, using the major key signatures. At what numbers? Major intervals will be 2, 3, 6, and 7, right? And perfect intervals will be which intervals? 1, 4, 5, and 8. Again, we always have to keep track of that. So we just have to keep that in mind all the time that major intervals are 2, 3, 6, and 7. And perfect intervals are 1, 4, 5, and 8. Now we're going to go on to the other qualities of intervals today. But in order to find them, we always are going to start with the major or perfect interval. Okay? So this is the way it works. A major interval, a half step larger, becomes augmented. Now remember how I said this, because in a couple weeks I'm going to say it again, and I'm going to tell you that I told you this. I'm going to remind you, okay? I'm telling you that a major interval, or an augmented interval, is a half step larger than a major interval. So here's a major interval, right? So remember, an interval is the distance between two notes. Here's a major interval. An augmented interval will be a half step larger. So if I raise the top note, it's a half step larger, right? The distance between my hands. But let me just show you one other thing. How would I do it if I changed it from the bottom note? I'd lower it.
That would still be augmented?
It'd be a half step larger, wouldn't it? So what we're talking about, an augmented interval is a half step larger than a major. I can either raise the top note or lower the bottom note. But since we're working from the bottom note, we are going to mostly, for a while, raise the top note. So an augmented interval, and by the way, this arrow up right now means larger. Remember that. The arrow in this case, that equals larger. And the arrow down equals smaller. So if I want to find an augmented interval, I would find the major and just make it a half step larger. Or if I was using 1, 4, 5, or 8, I would find the perfect interval, and I would also, to find the augmented interval, make the perfect interval a half step larger. So in this case, they're the same. Major or perfect. The differences come when I'm making the interval smaller. So if I make a major interval a half step smaller, 2, 3, 6, or 7, those will become minor intervals. So if I found a major interval, for example, and I made it a half step smaller with, say if the top note was natural, I would lower it with a flat. That would make it a half step smaller. And that would become a minor interval. A perfect interval, a half step smaller, 1, 4, 5, or 8, becomes diminished. So this is the difference. That's why you have to really keep track of this. Are you dealing with 2, 3, 6, or 7 major intervals in major keys, or 1, 4, 5, and 8 perfect intervals in major keys? Because you can see you get different answers here. Now if I make a minor interval a half step smaller, I also get a diminished. Or I could look at it from this point of view. I could say a major interval a whole step smaller becomes diminished. So this is how we get the other qualities of intervals. They start with the major and perfect. We can then make the interval larger and get the augmented interval in both the major and perfect. If we make the major interval a half step smaller, we get a minor interval. If we get a major interval a whole step smaller, we make it a diminished interval. If we start with a perfect interval, 1, 4, 5, or 8, and make it a half step smaller, we have a diminished interval. All right, let me show you how that works.